And let's say I want to create a customer interface. Look at that. Just before the customer name, I prefixed a capital letter I. This is a common naming convention. Okay, interfaces in general are prefixed with a capital letter I, the interface names I mean. Okay, now if you don't give that, we don't get a compiler error, but it is just a common convention. So if you look at that, we'll succeeded. Okay, so the reason why we do that is just by looking at the name, you can tell this is an interface and not a class. And if somebody is using that interface somewhere, let's say for example, iCustomer C1, okay, so just by looking at the name, you can say that, okay, this is an interface and not a class or a structure, you know. That's why we use the capital letter I in the name of the interface. Now, I told you interfaces can only contain declarations and no implementations. So for example, let's say I want to have a print method. So I'm saying void print. And then I close the method and a semicolon. You cannot have an implementation. Let's say for example, console.writeLine, hello. You cannot do this. Okay, if you try to do this, you will get a compiler error. So let's go ahead and build this. Okay, and we clearly says the error clearly says interface members cannot have definition or implementation. They need to only have declarations. So an interface member should only have the method declarations, property declarations, etc., but no implementations. Okay, so if you look at this interface, it has only declaration, the return type of the method, the name of the method, and then a semicolon without the curly braces and implementation. Okay, another important thing to keep in mind is that interface members, okay, this is an interface member, so interface members are public by default. Okay, and that does not mean you can use a public keyword like this. Okay, if you try to do that and when you try to build the solution, you get again a compiler error saying that the modifier public is not valid for this item. So interface members are public by default and you cannot have an explicit access modifier. We haven't spoken about access modifiers yet. We will be talking about them in a later session. But remember that on the interface members, you cannot have access modifiers. They are public by default. Okay, now can an interface have fields? No, we know that a class can have fields like int id, string name, etc. But an interface cannot have a field. So this is a field, an integer field. Now if I go ahead and try to build that again, we get a compiler error stating that interfaces cannot contain fields. So remember that as well. Okay, so we have this interface and this interface, let's say, can be implemented by a class. A class can inherit this interface. So let's say, for example, I have class customer and this class is inheriting iCustomer interface. Okay, so now this customer class is actually implementing this iCustomer interface. Okay, now when a class inherits an interface, that class has to provide implementation for this interface member. Okay, otherwise look at this, if it doesn't provide implementation and if somebody says customer C1 is equal to new customer, and then when I say C1.print, C1.print, we basically, since this class is inheriting from this interface, this method is available to this class, and if this class doesn't provide implementation, the interface didn't provide implementation for this method. And if the class doesn't provide implementation for that method, then what will this line do? That's why any class implementing an interface member, it could be a method, property, event, whatever. If the class inherits that interface, it has to provide the implementation for that interface member. Otherwise, we get a compiler error. Okay, now let's go ahead and try to compile this. Let's get rid of these lines. If I try to build this, you will get a compiler error stating that customer does not implement interface member print iCustomer.print. Okay, so The interface will only have declarations, and those interfaces are there for your classes or structures to implement, to provide implementation for those interfaces. You might be wondering, if the interfaces doesn't provide any implementation, then what is the use of these interfaces? Don't worry about that. We will actually talk about the real-time scenarios where we use these interfaces in a later session. But for now, let's understand the basics around interfaces, the rules around interfaces. Okay? All right. So this class has to provide the implementation for this interface member. So in order to do that, public, okay, we need to use the access modifier here, void, and then the name of the method. Now look at this. The signature of the method should exactly look similar to the method in the interface. For example, here I say, instead of the same signature, if I say name here, now this method is different from this. So the compiler doesn't treat as if you're implementing this print method here, because this print method signature is different. It has got a parameter here, but it doesn't have a parameter, in the interface declaration. So if you try to build this, you will again get the same error. Okay, so that's why the signature of the method in the class should match the signature of the method in the interface. So now if we go ahead and compile, it will compile without any issues. So you look at that, build succeeded in the status bar. Okay, so let's say for example console.writeLine, and we'll just put here interface print method. And then if somebody wants to create an instance of this class, what they can do is customer c1 is equal to new customer and c1 dot print. So if we go ahead and run that, interface print method,